What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. I know it's Spooktober and all that, but if I wanted to give you like a scary reading recommendation, I would just have you read my Tinder profile.
Heyo!
Recently I read two anthologies, one by a well-known author and another one by a popular author, but probably one that you might not have heard of before. And those were Full Throttle by Joe Hill, which was my most anticipated read of 2019, and then Warped by Jeff Menapace. And there were a lot of short stories involved in these two anthologies. There were more than like 10 per book. So I'll only be talking about my favorite and least favorite of those two anthologies today. Honestly, if I spent this video talking about like every single story in both of those anthologies, by the end of the video I would look like 2019 Keith Richards. But if you do want to see what I thought of every single short story, you can hop over to Goodreads and follow me there. I mean, you should be following me there already anyway, like in the immortal words of every Australian granny ever. Get your ass over there, now! I'll talk about Warped by Jeff Menapace first because that's the one you're least likely to have heard of out of those two anthologies. Personally, I don't even know how I came across it. I think I might have been looking at the list of award-winning indie horror books, and I think what happened was I saw a particular review that caught my eye for Warped. Anyway, it was a bit of an underwhelming start to that anthology because it started with the story called Straw Man and a Murder. And I mean, it's pretty obvious what that story was about just from the title. It was about a neglected child and a murderous scarecrow. And the word I used was generic, and I want to make it clear that that's not necessarily always a bad thing. I just think it applies best in this particular situation there wasn't anything particularly new in this story, and it's basically a subgenre in itself is scarecrow horror. Oi, we get a pretty bad rap, yeah? Jeepers Creepers was one thing, but this is the last straw, mate. Straw? Oi! But I will say this, it wasn't a bad start to the anthology. It was a little bit underwhelming, sure, but it wasn't bad. Because if there is anything I can say for this particular story and Jeff's writing style in general is that I got a really nostalgic, like horror vibe from this. It was almost like just from reading this story, you could tell that Jeff was a horror fan. He was passionate about writing horror, and you could tell he'd been a horror fan for a very long time. Sometimes it's just a bit more obvious that the writer is writing about something that they're passionate about, and that's kind of nice. There was a respectful, appreciation, almost like a homage in writing style to the atmosphere of old horror movies. You know, horror movies in a time where it was a bit predictable as to what was going to happen, but in most cases they knew that and they leaned into it. It was a bit shameless about how it was predictable in that sense, and that's kind of nice sometimes. There was also a story called Fish and Biscuits, which is like a flash fiction, and it was just really goofy. But it was so short it didn't really require a whole lot of commitment anyway. It was a fun little flash fiction. So there's two short stories in Warped that go hand in hand. There's Sugar Daddy and then the sequel to that one. And I know for a lot of people those are the two stories they enjoyed most, and I didn't hate them, but I'm really confused as to whether I did actually like them or not. It gave me a weird kind of conflicted feeling because the writing was good and at least the initial plot was pretty solid. But as it went on, it kind of felt like it deviated a lot from not just the genre of that story, but the theme of the anthology as a whole. It was about a small group of people who plan a heist within a really wealthy community of widows, and obviously the heist goes wrong and they uncover a really dark secret. And that whole part was fantastic, but there was a certain point right there where I think if it had ended, it would have been brilliant, but it just kind of kept going, and then it started trying to explain the scariness, tell you why it's scary. And by the time you realize they've done too much, it then goes into another short story, a sequel to that, and by the time I finished the second one, all spookiness was just ruined. The last one I want to mention from Warped is definitely the best one, and it's called Princess. This is about a man and his wife dealing with the aftermath of a really, really terrible tragedy. Their daughter died, and they're both dealing with it in quite different ways. And the mother's method of dealing with it is quite sinister, and basically the story is told through the eyes of the husband who is watching the love of his life go down this path that he doesn't agree with, but he still loves her, and he's obviously sympathetic because she's dealing with the grief of the loss of their child, and so is he. And it becomes this really, interesting, twisted, and, dark story with an actual subplot which is just as solid about the husband dealing with the moral conundrum of appeasing his obviously disturbed wife, love of his life, or doing the right thing. It's super interesting because the whole time you still don't know which way he's going to lean, and it becomes a bit of a game of guessing where the story's going to end. We're kept engaged as readers by the lingering question of which side is going to win out in that moral conundrum. All in all, I would give Warped 3 stars. There were a lot of really, really good short stories there, and I would even recommend this anthology to people to read. The problem, though, is that the weaker stories outnumbered the good ones. I would say Warped was okay, but not amazing. Basically like any music ever from Silverchair. I'm a freak of nature. So then we have Full Throttle by Joe Hill. It's no mystery, Joe Hill is my favorite author. And although a lot of people would say that would create a bias, and maybe it does, I don't know. I would say that the reason he is my favorite author is because he is objectively a great writer. Nevertheless, I went into this anthology trying to be as objective as possible with the writing. But I'm gonna be real, he was really good. And 2 of the stories were co-written by Stephen King as well, so that's both a father and son duo, and a father and son duo of some of the best writers in the horror genre. What I've noticed more and more with every short story I finish of Joe Hill's is that you start to see how much influence Stephen King had in his actual writing, and yet simultaneously Joe Hill still manages to be his own man and still have his own recognizable style. I think that's another one of the reasons I like him so much and respect him so much, is because rather than just ride the coattails of his father and use the King name to publish books and get popular that way, he went a bit more of a sneaky route and used a different name and ended up being published off the merit of his work. Joe Hill's writing is kind of like if Stephen King smoked some weed and wrote a book. Well, I should say smoked a ton more weed. I mean, look at this guy. He definitely blazes. Yo, man, like, what if instead of kids finding Narnia, it was an evil old dude, man? Oh, you mean kinda like Gargamel from Smurfs? Whoa! I think truthfully, Joe Hill is just also being quite a big inspiration on my own writing, because I feel like I had my own style beforehand, and I feel like my style meshes in pretty well with his style, so it just feels like I connect with him on a bit of a, hopefully not so creepy personal level. He's almost like my unknowing mentor. Teach me your ways. So the first story is called Throttle, and this is one of the ones that was co-written with Stephen King. King and Hill. King and the Hill!
The elf lord Flyfendel knelt upon the bed of dandelions. Young wanderer, quoth he.
So Throttle quite literally brings you crashing into the anthology with a story about a motorcycle gang that is being chased down by a mysterious trucker across an endless strip of desert highway. And somehow in such a short story, the Kings managed to include not just a whole lot of suspense, but also a bit of an actual plot to that chase. An engaging and emotional plot that includes a really interesting relationship dynamic between the father and son in that outlaw motorcycle gang, which is again pretty interesting considering the story is written by a father and son team. And to be honest, some of the best descriptive writing I've ever seen for gory situations was in Throttle. I would love to talk at length about pretty much every story in this anthology, but I have to keep the video at a pretty reasonable length. So another short story I would mention is called Fawn, a story basically entertaining the idea of what if an evil person found Narnia with modern day technology rather than 4 equally creepy, pasty little British kids?
I'm sure it's just your imagination.
I don't...
Some of the stories are also a little bit more goofy, a little bit more fun. In particular, I think my favorite of the goofy bunch... So stupid. My favorite would be Wolverton Station, which is basically a story about a dog-eat-dog style businessman, a bit of a wolf himself, basically getting cornered by a train full of furries. Your business practices are immoral, little man. Oh, actually, I have a better reference. The Mod Wolves from Mighty Boosh. Some of the stories also, quite strangely, steer away from Joe Hill's usual, dark punch niche to a bit of a more, optimistic, albeit, bittersweet approach. Particularly, I would mention You Are Released. It's like Joe wanted to test out throwing a bit more of, a different spin on traditional, uneasy fiction into a bunch of stories about gore and horror. And it confused me a little at first, but by the end of the story, I'd actually really come to appreciate it, and it's actually kind of like a weird, nice, kind of sad palate cleanser. On the topic of like war stories, one of my least favorite of the bunch would have been Thumbprint. This one was a war fiction basically about a woman who's come back from doing a tour of duty, and she's reflecting on her time in the war and some of the dark stuff that they had to do there, while she's also being hunted down by a mysterious person in the present. It wasn't necessarily bad, it just didn't, I don't know, it felt like it lacked a bit of the Joe Hill unusual twist or snap to it. It just felt like a pretty standard short fiction about an ex-soldier, which I imagine a lot of people enjoy, but I don't know, war fiction just never really enticed me that much. There was also All I Care About Is You, which was probably Joe's biggest leap from his normal type of writing, because this one was like a sci-fi. There was a lot of oddly named devices and all this stuff thrown in there, and it was a bit overwhelming at certain points. Although I was never really confused, so to speak, because the context and the name of these things always made it pretty obvious what he was talking about. I don't know. I don't know if sci-fi is something I enjoy from Joe Hill's style, or at least if that's not it, I don't know if it meshed too well thematically with all of the other stories in the anthology. The only story I genuinely disliked, and I would go so far as to say I think was a bad story, is By the Silver Water of Lake Champlain. I felt like it was kind of a little bit of a waste of time even to read. It just felt like the first page to a very boring book. To sum it up pretty quickly, I would just say some kids find a rock while they're out playing. Turns out it's not a rock, it's a big mysterious sea creature. That's basically it. That's all you need to know. And of course I have to mention as well, In the Tall Grass, my second favorite of the anthology, and it's actually now a movie on Netflix, so this is one you're probably already aware of. Actually, I haven't seen the movie yet because I wanted to read this first, so I'm probably going to watch the movie tonight. I'm really excited to. But this one was co-written with Stephen King as well, and it is really fantastic. It's basically about a brother and sister who on a road trip, and they end up pulling over next to this field of extraordinarily like green and high grass, and they hear a child in there calling for help, so they go in to help them, and before long they realize they can't get out, and weird, mysterious, and sinister things start happening while they're in there. I think one of the most fantastic things about this story, and a true testament to both Stephen and Joe's writing, is that they managed to make a story set in an open field feel so immensely claustrophobic. There are so many more just remarkable short stories in Full Throttle that I would love to talk about, but like I said, I want to keep the video a reasonable length. But in my Goodreads reviews for both Warped and Full Throttle, I'm going to leave separate like star values and mini reviews for every single short story, so you can check them all out there. The link to my Goodreads is in the description. Full Throttle wasn't quite as good as Strange Weather, I think, but it was still really fantastic. So I'm going to give it 4 stars, and Joe gets to keep his spot as my number 1 awesome good time favorite author. Congratulations, master. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.
She's got class and style, street knowledge by the pound, yeah. Baby never act wild, very low key on the profile. Catching feelings is the norm.